Welcome to this overview of the Panic of 1819, the first depression that the United States faced after gaining its independence from Great Britain. Even before the War of 1812, American trade had been hampered by hostilities between France and Great Britain. Each country tried to interfere with the economy of the other. France wanted to hurt British textile productions, so they didn't want the United States to sell cotton to Britain. And the British didn't want Napoleon or France to gain support anywhere because they wanted to break Napoleon's power in Europe. That resulted in Thomas Jefferson banning trade with either country during his presidency. Europe was coming out of a decade of continental wars driven by Napoleon's attempt to take over all of Europe for a French Empire. Wars cost money and they require a lot of material, so control of trade during wartime is critical. You'll remember that the British tried to gain more sailors for the Navy during its wars with Napoleon by impressing American sailors, claiming that they were actually British deserters. You might remember that the French tried to manipulate the American population through a media campaign to elect leaders who would support France in its wars in Europe, who would choose to trade with France over England. Think about the XYZ affair or Citizen Genet. The trade problems, compounded by English support for Native Americans who attacked frontier settlers, triggered the War of 1812, when the United States declared war on Great Britain. During the War of 1812, there was no trade with England, which otherwise would have been a major purchaser of southern cotton. During the War of 1812, Napoleon was still building his empire with an ill-planned invasion of Russia. Hang on while I change my notes. And the British made every effort to block trade with France to thwart Napoleon's plans. And because the American economy was so restricted during the War of 1812, the need for local manufacturing became apparent. To foster growth of industry in our own country, Congress passed protective tariffs. Those tariffs placed high taxes on goods from other countries, goods which otherwise could be purchased in the United States. And that was to help manufacturers in the United States gain an economic advantage so Americans would choose to buy American products as long as the cost was going to be equal to that of imported goods. In 1814, the European wars ended when Napoleon abdicated and went into exile. The War of 1812 ended. The United States was free to begin trading with all of Europe again. At first, as the European recovery got underway, there was a large demand for American raw materials, especially foodstuffs. Europeans had to restore battlefields to fields for crops before they could resume full food production. This was a time of prosperity for the United States because demand for American goods was high. Because demand for American goods was high, especially foodstuffs, Americans wanted to push further west and cultivate more land. They borrowed money to buy land and they started cutting trees, tilling land, and building new homes and towns. Because of the boom, the Second Bank of the United States, which you can see featured here in this slide, this is the front of the building, that bank had expanded credit, and a lot of people were buying and speculating on land in western areas of states or in new territories. Eventually, though, the European economy regained its own equilibrium. The demand for American goods dropped off. Suddenly, American goods were quite a bit more expensive than imported goods would have been without the tariff. Americans weren't selling as much abroad, so they stopped purchasing as many goods. That slowed down business, and businesses started to fail. Westerners who depended on high commodities prices to pay on their mortgage lands didn't have enough income to make their payments. The Second Bank of the United States started to foreclose on loans that were behind, which triggered loss of farms and loss of businesses. And we're not to the section quite yet, but we are going to see that this generated a lot of ill will towards especially the Second Bank of the United States, but also banks in general. And down the road, Andrew Jackson is going to feed off of that anger towards the banks that stemmed from the Panic of 1819, and he's going to use that to galvanize American sentiment against the Second Bank of the United States and ultimately kill it. Andrew Jackson represented Western interests and the common people, and those people were left with a bad taste in their mouth about banks after the result of losing their property for many of them as a result of the Panic of 1819. So since that panic and every other financial crisis, bankers and economic specialists in the government have studied what went wrong. We'll learn more lessons about financial reversals as we look at other panics in the 19th century. And some of the key factors to look at are rate of tariffs, agricultural output, often determined by weather and other natural events, trade relations, and the heating up of real estate markets.